The line of succession of Britain's monarchs stretches back hundreds of years, but that succession was not always smooth. During the Wars of the Roses, the throne of England was fought over between the houses of York and Lancaster, causing many controversies, but none were as controversial as the events of 1483. This is the history of the Princes in the Tower. The Princes in the Tower were the children of Edward IV and were named Edward and Richard. Edward was born on the 2nd of November 1470 at the medieval house of the Abbot of Westminster, adjoining Westminster Abbey. Richard was born on the 17th of August 1473 and was made Duke of York in May 1474. Both had royal upbringings. Edward, being the heir, was strictly supervised by his uncle Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, and his day was timetabled by his father, the King. On the 9th of April 1483, Edward IV of England died unexpectedly after an illness lasting around 3 weeks. At the time, Edward's son, the new King Edward V, was at Ludlow Castle, and the dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. The news reached Gloucester around the 15th of April, although he may have been forewarned of Edward's illness. It is reported that he then went to York Minster to publicly pledge his loyalty to the new king. The Croyland Chronicles state that, before his death, Edward IV designated his brother Gloucester as Lord Protector. On the 29th of April, Richard met Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, at Northampton. At the Queen's request, Earl Rivers was escorting the young king to London with an armed escort of 2,000 men, while Richard and Buckingham's joint escort was 600 men. Edward V himself had been sent further south to Stony Stratford. At first convivial, Richard had Earl Rivers, his nephews Richard Grey and his associate Thomas Vaughan arrested. They were taken to Pontefract Castle, where they were executed on the 25th of June on the charges of treason against the Lord Protector. Richard then took possession of the prince himself, prompting Elizabeth Woodville to take her son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Edward V and Richard arrived in London together. Plans continued for Edward's coronation, but the date was postponed from the 4th of May to 25th of June. On 19th of May 1483, Edward was lodged in the Tower of London, then the traditional residence of monarchs prior to coronation. On 16th of June, he was joined by his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. At this point, the date of Edward's coronation was indefinitely postponed by their uncle, Richard. On Sunday, 22nd of June, a sermon was preached at St Paul's Cross, claiming Gloucester to be the only legitimate heir of the House of York. On 25th of June, a group of lords, knights and gentlemen petitioned Richard to take the throne. Both princes were subsequently declared illegitimate by Parliament. This was confirmed in 1484 by the Act of Parliament known as the Titulus Regius. The Act stated that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was invalid because of Edward's pre-contract to marry with Lady Eleanor Butler. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England on the 6th of July. Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who visited England in the 1480s and who was in London in the spring and summer of 1483, recorded that after Richard seized the throne, Edward and his younger brother Richard were taken into the inner apartments of the tower, and then were seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. Mancini records that during this period, Edward was regularly visited by a doctor, who reported that Edward, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. There are reports of the two princes being seen playing in the tower grounds shortly after Richard joined his brother, but there are no recorded sightings of either of them after the summer of 1483. An attempt was made to rescue the princes in late July, but the attempt failed and perhaps sealed their fate. The princes disappeared, and their fate remains an enduring mystery. Many historians conclude that Richard III, the prince's uncle, is the likeliest culprit in the case of the disappearance of the princes, for a number of reasons. Although the princes had been eliminated from the succession, Richard's hold on the monarchy was very insecure due to the way in which he had attained the crown, leading to a backlash against him by the Yorkist establishment. An attempt had already been made to rescue them and restore Edward to the throne. Clear evidence that the existence of the princes would remain a threat as long as they were alive. Richard was away from court on a progression through the Yorkist heartland at the time of the princes' disappearance. If they died at this time, he would have been unable to murder them in person. They were under guard in the Tower of London, which was controlled by his men, and access to them was strictly limited by his instructions. He could therefore have dispatched one of his retainers to murder the princes on his behalf, but it is unlikely they could have been murdered without his knowledge. Another suspect is Richard's right-hand man, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, but Stafford being a suspect depends on the princes having already been dead by the time of Stafford's execution in November 1483. Henry VII has also been accused. Following his seizure of the crown, he executed some of the rival claimants to the throne. John of Gloucester, illegitimate son of Richard III, is said by some sources to have been one of those executed. Henry was out of the country between the prince's disappearance and August 1485. Thus, his only opportunity to murder them would have been after his ascension in 1485. One theory suggests Henry, or those acting on his orders, is the only plausible alternative to Richard III. The year after becoming king, Henry married the prince's eldest sister Elizabeth of York to reinforce his claim to the throne. Not wanting the legitimacy of his wife, or her claim as heir of Edward IV called into question, prior to the marriage he had repealed the Titulus Regius, which had previously declared the princes and Elizabeth illegitimate. This theory suggests the princes were executed under Henry's orders between the 16th of June and 16th of July 1486, claiming that it was only after this date that orders went out to circulate the story that Richard had killed the princes, and that the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, knew that this story was false, and so Henry had to have her silenced. Some historians have also accused John Howard, 1st Duke of Norfolk, Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, and Jane Shore, Edward IV's mistress. But of these theories, none deserve serious consideration. The problem with all these accusations is that they beg the question of access to the tower without Richard's knowledge, and overlook the fact that Richard was responsible for the safekeeping of his nephews. The Beaufort theory has more recently been supported by Philippa Gregory in her BBC documentary series The Real White Queen and Her Rivals, but is not supported by any evidence other than a speculative one of possible motive. The political reality of the disappearance of the princes, whatever happened to them, is that they were believed to have been murdered by Richard. Even if he had not been directly responsible for the deaths, the fact that he had deposed them and kept them under tight guard made him responsible for their welfare in the eyes of contemporaries, and the belief that they had been murdered made him guilty by negligence, if not malice. In 1487, Lambert Simnel initially claimed to be the Duke of York, but later claimed to be York's cousin, the Earl of Warwick. From 1491 until his capture in 1497, Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the Duke of York, having supposedly escaped to Flanders. Warbeck's claim was supported by some contemporaries, including York's aunt, the Duchess of Burgundy. In 1674, workmen at the tower dug up, from under the staircase, a wooden box containing two small human skeletons. The bones were widely accepted at the time as those of the princes, but this has not been proven and is far from certain. King Charles II had the bones buried in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. The truth of the prince's mysterious disappearance may never be known, and remains a hotly debated subject, which often comes down to whether you support Richard III or not. In reality, Richard III is listed as a usurper, and was most likely to have murdered his nephews.